Before the first breath, there was only the void. No horizon, no depth, no sound. It was a stillness so complete that time itself had no meaning. Then, the silence shattered. A single voice cut through the nothingness. A command that rippled outward into the infinite dark. Light ignited. It did not flicker. It erupted. A blinding, white-hot expansion that pushed the shadows back to the corners of existence. Where the light touched, the formless began to take shape. The deep waters churned, separating from the dry land. As the earth groaned and surged upward from the abyss, mountains tore through the surface, jagged and raw, while the atmosphere rushed in to fill the hollows. Above, the stars ignited in a sudden, rhythmic pulse, anchoring the heavens to the new world below. The chaos of the void surrendered to order. The world was a canvas of fire, stone, and water. The earth was now a living stage, yet it remained empty. A new stillness descended, different from the void. It was a quiet of anticipation. From the damp, cooling dust of the ground, the first form took shape. It was molded with intent, every contour defined by a master hand. Then came the breath. It moved into the chest, a sudden, sharp intake of air that forced the lungs to expand and the heart to hammer against ribs. Eyes opened. The world rushed in the vibrant green of the canopy, the scent of crushed herbs, the cool mist rising from the river. Beside him, another stirred, rising from the same earth, eyes meeting his in the first moment of recognition. They stood in the center of a garden where the trees bowed under the weight of ripening fruit, and the rivers ran clear over polished stones. No shadows stretched across the grass. No wind carried the threat of decay. They walked through the tall ferns, their feet pressing into soft moss. The harmony of the garden began to fray at the edges. It started with a subtle change in the air, a drop in temperature that made the leaves stop their gentle swaying. The birds that had filled the canopy with song fell silent. Their calls cut short as if something had stifled the very breath of the woods. Eve stood before the tree, her gaze fixed on the fruit that hung heavy and vibrant against the dark, twisted branches. The rest of the garden seemed to recede, the vibrant colors dulling into a singular, oppressive focus on the bough above. She took a step forward. The moss beneath her feet felt different, no longer soft, but dense and unyielding. She did not look back at the path she had traveled. Her attention narrowed until the world was nothing but the texture of the bark. Under her fingertips and the weight of the fruit swaying slightly in the stagnant air, she raised her hand. The skin of the fruit broke. A sharp, acidic scent filled the air, replacing the sweet perfume of the garden. As she swallowed, the light above the canopy fractured. The sun did not set, yet the sky bled into a bruised, heavy gray. Shadows that had never existed before crawled out from behind the trees, lengthening rapidly until they swallowed the path. The ground beneath them shuddered, a low tremor that cracked the dry earth. They turned to run, but the familiar trees now blocked their way, branches twisting into jagged, impassable barriers. The air grew cold, biting at their skin. They scrambled through the thicket, tearing their hands on thorns that had not been there moments before. The lush moss turned to grit and stone. The river behind them slowed to a stagnant, muddy trickle. They reached the edge of the garden where the vibrant green died into a gray, barren expanse of dust and wind. They crossed the threshold. The wilderness was a hard taskmaster. Cain and Abel worked the soil, their movements rhythmic and heavy under the relentless sun. The ground was stubborn, resisting the plow, forcing them to sweat for every meager stalk of grain or head of livestock. Tension grew in the silence between them, a slow accumulation of unspoken grievances. One day, they stood in the center of a wide, barren field. The air was thick with heat and the smell of dry earth. Cain watched Abel, his jaw set, his grip tightening on the heavy tool he held. The difference in their labor, the difference in the favor they sought, became a physical weight pressing down on the space between them. Without a word, the distance vanished. Cain stepped forward, his arm swinging in a sharp, brutal arc. The impact was dull and final. Abel fell, his body hitting the dirt. Cain stood over him, his breath ragged. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep from the wound, soaking rapidly into the parched ground. The earth drank the blood, and for the first time, the soil held the mark of human violence. Cain looked down at his hands. then at the horizon. Generations bled into one another, and the earth grew heavy with the weight of human malice. Violence became the common language of the streets. Every path led to a new conflict, and every settlement echoed with the sounds of discord. The air itself seemed to thicken with the stench of ruin. Amidst this spreading decay, one man stood apart. Noah moved with a singular purpose, his hands calloused from the labor of a task that defied the logic of his neighbors. He dragged massive beams of gopher wood across the dry, cracked plains, his muscles straining against the weight. He hammered iron spikes into the timber, the rhythmic clang of metal on wood ringing out like a warning. The structure rose, a skeletal giant against the horizon, its scale defying the surrounding desolation. Neighbors watched from the distance, their jeers lost in the rising wind. The sky began to change. High above, clouds gathered, not in wisps, but in dense, bruised layers that blotted out the sun. The pressure dropped, making the ears pop and the breath catch in the throat. Noah wiped the grit from his brow, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the darkness was absolute. He drove the final wedge into the hull, the sound sharp and final. The ark was ready. The first drop struck the dry earth like a bullet, followed instantly by a roar that drowned out the wind. The sky opened, not in a shower, but in a solid wall of water that hammered the landscape. Within minutes, the dust turned to slick, impassable sludge. Noah sealed the final hatch, the heavy timber groaning. Outside, the world dissolved. The small streams became raging torrents, tearing through the valleys and uprooting the ancient trees. The water rose with terrifying speed, swirling around the base of the mountains, turning solid rock into islands. There was no escape from the tide. It surged upward, claiming the lowlands, then the foothills, and finally the peaks themselves. 40 days and 40 nights the rain hammered down, erasing the landmarks of the old world. The world was gone, replaced by a silent, endless sea that stretched toward every edge of the horizon. The silence of the deep lasted for weeks until the currents shifted. The water level began to drop, not in a rush, but with a slow, steady retreat that left behind layers of silt and debris. High peaks emerged first, jagged and slick, breaking the surface like the backs of sleeping leviathans. The ark drifted, its hull scraping against the hidden summit of a mountain, coming to a shuddering, final halt. Noah pushed open the hatch, the air rushing in cold and sharp, smelling of wet earth and salt. Above, the thick, bruised clouds began to fray at the edges. A single shaft of golden light pierced the gloom, striking the mist that still clung to the valleys. As the light hit the moisture, the sky ignited. A brilliant arc of color stretched from one horizon to the other, vibrant and impossible against the fading gray. It was a bridge of light, a silent marker of a new reality. The ground below began to steam as the sun reclaimed the land. The waters continued to drain away into the deep fissures of the earth, leaving behind a landscape stripped clean. Noah stepped out onto the damp, firm soil, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. The rainbow held its position, a steady, luminous promise etched against the clearing sky. The survivors of the flood gathered on the plains of Shinar. Driven by a singular ambition, they began to bake bricks, firing them in massive kilns until they were hard as stone. They used bitumen for mortar, stacking the blocks higher and higher, aiming to pierce the very clouds. The tower rose, a jagged monument of human will. Men worked in rhythm, their voices unified in a single tongue, their movements synchronized by a common goal. Then, the air shifted. The rhythm broke. A mason reached for a tool, but the request he spoke sounded like grinding gravel to his partner. The foreman shouted orders, but his words dissolved into nonsensical syllables. The unity that had fueled the ascent shattered instantly. Confusion rippled through the scaffolding. Men dropped their trowels, staring at one another with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The project stalled, then collapsed into a cacophony of shouting and frantic gestures. No one could relay a command. No one could understand a plea. Frustration turned to fear as the realization took hold that they were now strangers to their own kin. The massive structure was abandoned, left half-finished against the sky. The people drifted away in small, isolated groups, moving in different directions across the vast, empty earth. The tower stood as a silent, crumbling reminder, The world had fractured into 1,000 tongues, but in the quiet corners of the land, a different voice stirred. Abraham stood at the threshold of his home, his hand resting on the latch of a door he had known his entire life. He looked back once at the hearth, then turned toward the horizon where the sun dipped low, casting long shadows. He packed only what was essential, leaving the comfort of his kin and the security of his ancestral soil. With every step, the familiar landmarks faded, replaced by the rugged, shifting terrain of the unknown. One night, he stopped in the middle of an expansive, dust-blown plain. He looked up. The sky was a vast, velvet expanse, crowded with more stars than he could count. The air was still cold and sharp. He would be the father of a multitude. His lineage as countless as the grains of sand beneath his feet and the stars burning above him. The promise did not vanish with the passing of the patriarch. It took root in Isaac, flowing forward through the generations until it reached Jacob. Jacob lived a life of constant movement, a man fleeing the consequences of his own choices. He reached the banks of the Jabbok River under the cover of a moonless night, his heart heavy with the fear of a brother he had wronged. He sent his family across the water, remaining alone in the dark. The silence was shattered by a sudden, violent impact. A stranger lunged from the shadows, locking arms with him. There were no words, only the sound of strained breathing and the thud of bodies hitting the dirt. They grappled in the mud, neither gaining the upper hand. The stranger was relentless, a force of unyielding pressure that pushed Jacob to his absolute limit. They wrestled through the hours, muscles burning, skin slick with sweat and river silt. As the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, the stranger struck Jacob's hip, forcing him to his knees. Jacob clung to his opponent, refusing to let go until he received a blessing. The stranger spoke, and the name Jacob was cast aside. He was now Israel, a man who had fought with the divine and survived. The sun rose over the valley, casting long, sharp shadows across the ground, and Israel stood, limping, a changed man stepping into a new future. The fields of Dothan stretched wide under a relentless sun, shimmering with heat. Joseph walked toward his brothers, his pace steady, unaware of the tension coiled in the air. As he approached, the conversation stopped. The brothers did not greet him. They moved with a synchronized, cold efficiency. They surrounded him before he could speak, their hands grabbing his arms, pinning him against the hard, sun-baked soil. He struggled, but the weight of their resentment was absolute. They dragged him toward a deep, abandoned cistern that scarred the landscape like an open wound. The air inside the pit smelled of stagnant dust and ancient stone. With a final, forceful shove, they pushed him over the edge. Joseph tumbled, his body striking the rough, uneven walls before he landed hard on the dry floor. He gasped, the wind knocked from his lungs, and looked up. The sky was reduced to a small, jagged circle of blue far above. He heard the muffled sound of voices, then the crunch of boots receding into the distance. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. He reached out, his fingers tracing the jagged rock of the walls, realizing the path he had walked that morning had vanished. Years of silence passed within the damp, lightless walls of the dungeon. Joseph remained a prisoner of circumstance, his days measured by the drip of water and the slow crawl of shadows. Then, the palace was gripped by a different kind of darkness. Pharaoh's dreams haunted the halls, leaving his advisors speechless and his heart restless. The king required an answer that no seer could provide. Joseph was brought from the depths, his face pale from years of confinement, his eyes sharp with a clarity born of long solitude. He stood before the throne, the air thick with the scent of incense and the weight of an empire. He listened to the visions of 7 gaunt cows and 7 blighted stalks of grain. Joseph spoke with a steady, unyielding voice, mapping out the coming years of abundance followed by the hollow grip of starvation. The court fell silent. Pharaoh saw the truth in the interpretation and acted. The chains were struck from Joseph's wrists. He was elevated, given the signet ring, and charged with the survival of the land. He moved through the granaries, overseeing the massive harvest that would sustain a nation. As the first winds of the drought began to howl across the borders, Egypt stood ready. Joseph watched from the high balcony, the architect of a future that would feed the world when the earth turned to dust. Time moved forward, and the memory of Joseph faded into the stone of the palace walls. A new pharaoh ascended the throne, one who did not know the man who had saved the empire from the famine. He looked out over the growing numbers of the Israelites and saw only a threat. The shift was sudden and absolute. The state turned its machinery against them. Guards arrived in the settlements, driving the people from their homes. The work was relentless. Men were forced to haul heavy loads of clay and straw under a sun that offered no mercy. The air in the brickyards grew thick with dust and the smell of sweat. Overseers moved among the rows, their voices sharp. When a worker stumbled or slowed, the sound of the lash cracked through the air, a sharp, biting noise. The Israelites bent under the strain, their backs permanently curved by the weight of the stones they carried. Moses led his flock into the deep silence of the desert, far from the reach of the Egyptian taskmasters. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and parched scrub. He reached the slopes of Horeb, where the air grew still. Suddenly, a flicker of light caught his eye. A bush stood amidst the rocks, wreathed in flames that danced with a hungry intensity. Yet, the leaves did not char. The branches did not turn to ash. Moses stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel, his pulse quickening as the fire defied the laws of nature. He reached out, then recoiled as a voice resonated from the heart of the light, calling his name. He fell to his knees, shielding his eyes from the brilliance. The command was absolute. He was to return to the center of his people's suffering, to stand before the palace gates and demand their release. He stood, gathered his staff, and began the long walk back to the land of chains. Moses stood before the throne, his staff held firm against the polished stone floor. Pharaoh dismissed the demand with a wave of his hand, but the response came from the river itself. The Nile, the lifeblood of the empire, began to churn. The clear water darkened, thickening into a deep, metallic red. Fish floated to the surface, their scales dull, as the current turned into a sluggish, viscous flow of blood. The stench of decay rose from the banks, choking the air of the city. Before the shock could settle, the second sign erupted. From the depths of the tainted river, a movement rippled outward. Thousands of frogs crawled onto the mud, their wet skin glistening in the sun. They entered the homes, leaping across tables and settling into the sleeping quarters. The rhythmic croaking grew into a deafening roar. The people fled the streets, but there was no sanctuary from the swarm. The pride of the palace was buried under the weight of the plague. The sun vanished at midday. A thick, suffocating gloom descended, blotting out the sky and turning the grand monuments into jagged silhouettes. For 3 days, no lamp could pierce the void, and no man dared to move from his place. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of a nation paralyzed by fear. Then, the darkness lifted, but the air remained heavy with an unseen weight. In the homes of the Israelites, the tension reached its peak. They marked their doorframes with the blood of a lamb, a sign against the coming judgment. Inside, they stood ready, staff in hand, eating in haste. Outside, the night grew unnaturally cold. A stillness settled over the land, a hollow quiet that preceded a storm. Then, the sound of a great wailing erupted from the palace and spread through every street. It started as a low tremor and rose into a chorus of grief that shattered the night. The final plague had claimed its due. In the heart of the capital, the pride of the empire crumbled as the firstborn fell. The Israelites did not look back. They moved toward the gates, the weight of generations of chains finally snapping as they stepped into the cool, uncertain air of the wilderness. The horizon behind them churned with the dust of chariots. The Egyptian army surged forward, a wall of bronze and iron closing the distance. Ahead, the sea stood as an impassable barrier, its waves crashing against the jagged rocks. The people huddled at the shoreline, the spray of the surf stinging their faces. Moses stepped to the water's edge and raised his staff high. A sudden, violent wind tore through the air, howling with a force that bent the trees. The water began to recoil. It did not merely recede, it split. A massive, roaring chasm opened in the deep, the waves piling up like glass walls. The seabed emerged, slick with salt and tangled with seaweed, revealing a path through the heart of the abyss. The Israelites surged forward, their feet pounding against the wet sand. They moved in a frantic, rhythmic mass, passing between the towering, trembling walls. Behind them, the sea held its breath, suspended in a terrifying balance. They reached the far bank, their lungs burning, their eyes fixed on the safety of the distant dunes. As the last of the line crossed, the path remained open, a silent testament to the power that had carved a road through the impossible. The desert heat radiated from the jagged peaks of Sinai. The Israelites set up camp in the valley, their tents stretching across the sand like a vast, restless sea. The mountain loomed above them, a silent sentinel of stone. Then, the sky changed. A dense, swirling cloud descended, wrapping the summit in a suffocating gray veil. Thunder rolled across the plains, vibrating through the ground and into the souls of every person watching. Lightning flickered within the smoke, casting erratic, blinding flashes against the granite face. Moses stepped away from the crowd. He began the ascent, his pace steady despite the tremor shaking the earth. As he climbed, the air grew thin and charged with static. He vanished into the heart of the cloud, leaving the world of men behind. For days, the mountain burned with a fire that did not consume. The people waited, their eyes locked on the summit, listening to the muffled roar of the divine presence. Then, the cloud parted. The mountain fell silent. Moses emerged from the mist, his form silhouetted against the harsh light of the sun. He walked down the steep, rocky slope, his hands gripping two heavy slabs of stone. He reached the base, the weight of the law now resting in his hands. The days stretched into weeks, and the silence from the mountain grew heavy. In the valley, the initial awe faded into restlessness. The people paced the perimeter of the camp, their eyes darting toward the peak where Moses had vanished. When he did not return, the uncertainty turned into a frantic, collective demand. They gathered their gold, stripping away rings and ornaments, tossing them into a roaring furnace. The metal liquefied, glowing with a fierce, unnatural heat. They poured the molten stream into a mold, and as it cooled, the shape of a calf emerged. It stood in the center of the camp, catching the harsh desert light. A roar went up from the crowd, a sound of misplaced devotion. They began to dance, their movements frantic and uncoordinated, circling the idol with a fervor that bordered on madness. The air, filled with the clatter of drums and the shrill cries of revelers, they abandoned the discipline of the desert, surrendering to the chaos of the moment. Wine flowed, and the ground shook under the weight of their feet. They had traded the unseen for the tangible, bowing before the work of their own hands while the mountain above remained cold and still. The revelry died as quickly as it had ignited, replaced by the crushing weight of the consequence. The desert did not offer forgiveness, only distance. They packed their tents, the fabric frayed by the relentless wind, and began the long trek into the vast, featureless expanse. Day after day, the sun beat down, bleaching the rocks and turning the sand into a furnace. They walked until their sandals wore through, their paths dictated by the movement of the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. The cycle became their existence. They rose before dawn to harvest manna from the dew-dampened earth, ground it between stones, and marched until the horizon blurred into the twilight. Years bled into one another. Children born in the shadow of the mountain grew to adulthood, their faces etched with the grit and heat of the wilderness. The older generation, those who had seen the sea part, slowed and eventually stopped, their bodies claimed by the shifting dunes. Footprints were the only permanent markers of their passage, carved into the sand only to be erased by the next gust of wind. The long years of wandering ended at the base of a towering barrier. Jericho loomed ahead, its massive stone walls rising like a cliff against the sky. For 6 days, the people circled the city in silence, their footsteps muffled by the dust. Only the rhythmic cadence of their movement disturbed the air. On the 7th day, the pace quickened. Joshua stood at the front, his hand raised, signaling the final rotation. They circled 7 times, the tension tightening with every pass. Then, the signal came. The priests lifted their horns, and a piercing, unified blast tore through the stillness. The sound was not merely a note, it was a physical force. The earth beneath them shuddered. Cracks spiderwebbed across the mortar of the massive fortifications. With a roar, the walls buckled outward. Huge blocks of masonry crashed into the earth, sending plumes of choking dust into the air. The barrier vanished in a heartbeat. The people surged forward, their path into the promised land finally clear. The silence of the desert was replaced by the thunder of a nation. The momentum of the conquest slowed as the people settled into the land. Without a central authority, the unity forged in the desert dissolved. They turned away from their traditions, and the surrounding nations moved in to fill the void. Oppression followed, as harvests were seized and villages were raided. The people cried out, and in the silence that followed, a leader emerged. Gideon stood in the threshing floor, the air thick with the smell of chaff. He needed a sign that the burden would be lifted. He laid a fleece of wool upon the ground, a patch of white against the dark, dry earth. He prayed for the dew to gather only on the wool while the ground remained parched. He woke before the sun to find the fleece heavy with water, yet the soil beneath was bone dry. He wrung the moisture into a bowl, the liquid pooling in the morning light. Still, he tested again, reversing the sign to be certain. The ground soaked up the dew while the fleece remained dry. These acts of faith marked the beginning of a cycle that would define the era. It was a time of jagged edges, where survival depended on these sudden turns toward the divine. The temple was a cavern of stone and noise, filled with the jeers of the crowd. Samson stood in the center, his hands pressed against the two primary pillars that held the weight of the roof. The air was thick with the scent of incense. He felt the rough, cold texture of the stone beneath his palms. He did not look up. He closed his eyes and pushed. The muscles in his shoulders corded, and the stone groaned in protest. A hairline crack appeared at the base of the pillar, spiderwebbing outward into the floor. The crowd's laughter faltered, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. Samson leaned his entire weight into the stone, his feet digging into the foundation. The temple tilted, the roof beams shrieked. Dust rained down in thick, choking clouds. He gave one final, desperate heave. The pillars snapped with the sound of a mountain splitting. The entire structure buckled, the stone roof collapsing in a thunderous roar. The world vanished in a storm of falling masonry. The era of the judges dissolved into a landscape of fragmented loyalties. Without a single voice to guide them, the tribes drifted apart, their borders porous and their defenses thin. The people looked across their boundaries at the surrounding nations, observing the rigid order of standing armies and centralized thrones. They saw a strength they lacked. The dissatisfaction grew in the marketplaces and at the village wells. It was not a sudden shift, but a slow, grinding erosion of their old ways. They began to gather at the city gates, their voices rising in a unified, persistent chant. They wanted a king. They wanted a crown to anchor their identity, and a sword to command their battles. Elders stood in the squares, pointing to the history, but their warnings were drowned out by the clamor of the crowd. The people did not want the burden of self-governance. They wanted the security of a master. The air in the assembly grew heavy with the weight of this collective decision. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the demand became an ultimatum. Saul took the throne with the weight of a nation resting on his shoulders, but the crown sat uneasily. At first he led with vigor, his presence commanding the respect of the tribes. Yet, the pressure of the office began to erode his resolve. He started to look over his shoulder, seeking approval. When the moment came to act, he hesitated. He bypassed the clear instructions he had been given. The change was subtle at first. A missed command, a delayed march, a decision made in fear. His advisors noticed the shift in his gaze. He no longer looked toward the horizon with certainty, but toward the shadows. The divine favor began to withdraw, leaving a hollow stillness. He paced the floorboards, hands trembling. The authority he possessed became a brittle shell. By the time he stood before his generals, his voice lacked steel. The valley floor was a silent divide between two terrified armies. Goliath stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the dry earth. He roared, his voice vibrating against the hills, mocking the men who stood frozen in their ranks. No one moved. No one dared to answer. Then, a boy walked out from the rear, carrying nothing but a staff and a leather sling. He ignored the laughter of the soldiers and the warnings of his brothers. He knelt by the stream, selected 5 smooth stones, and slipped one into the pouch. The giant watched, his massive frame shifting as he prepared to crush the intruder. David did not stop to talk. He began to spin the sling, the leather whistling through the air with a sharp, rhythmic snap. The giant lunged, his heavy stride shaking the ground, but he was too slow. David released the stone. It cut through the air, a blur of motion, that found its mark with a sickening thud. Goliath stiffened, his eyes losing focus, and he crashed forward, face first into the dirt. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, the armies broke. The giant lay motionless, and the shepherd boy stood alone in the center of the field. The walls of Jerusalem stood firm, the city now the undisputed pulse of the nation. David did not linger in the quiet of his palace. He turned his attention to the hills, where the Ark of the Covenant waited. He ordered the procession to begin, the air filled with the sound of trumpets and the rhythmic thud of feet on stone. As the golden chest moved toward the city gates, David stepped out from the ranks of his guards. He shed his heavy mantle, letting it fall to the dust. He began to move, his feet finding a frantic, joyous rhythm against the hard ground. He spun, he leaped, he threw his arms toward the sky, ignoring the stares of the nobility watching from the balconies. The procession slowed, then stopped, as the ark crossed the threshold into the city. He did not stop his dance. He moved with a raw, physical intensity that ignored the boundaries of his station. By the time the ark was set in its place, the city had been transformed. It was the center of the kingdom, anchored by David at its heart. The wars continued, but the king stayed behind. David walked the flat stone roof of his palace as the sun dipped low, casting long, sharp shadows across the courtyard. Below, in the cooling air, a woman bathed in the privacy of her garden. David stopped. He watched her for a long moment, the silence of the palace pressing in around him. He did not turn away. Instead, he signaled his attendants, his voice low, issuing a command that cut through the quiet of the evening. They crossed the city, entered the house, and brought her to the palace. The doors closed behind them. In the dim light of the upper chambers, the boundaries of his reign dissolved. He took what was not his. When the morning broke, the world looked the same, but the foundation had shifted. The king now stood in the shadow of his own betrayal. The palace felt colder, the halls wider, and the weight of what he had done began to settle into the stone beneath his feet. Solomon inherited a kingdom of stone and blood, but he sought to build something that would outlast the memory of his father. He cleared the site on the high hill, marking the boundaries with heavy iron stakes. Thousands of laborers arrived, their tools ringing against the bedrock. From the northern forests, massive trunks of cedar were hauled down to the coast, their scent heavy and sharp in the humid air. The ships arrived laden with gold, ivory, and polished stone, turning the harbor into a hive of frantic activity. Solomon walked the site daily, his eyes tracing the rising walls as they climbed toward the sky. He ordered the interior lined with cedar. Then came the gold. It was beaten into thin, shimmering sheets and hammered over every surface, turning the inner sanctum into a blinding reflection. The structure grew, a mountain of wealth and precision that dwarfed the surrounding city. When the final stone was set in place, the temple dominated the horizon. The smell of cedar and the glint of gold defined the era, a physical manifestation of power that left the people below in awe. The breath left Solomon, and the silence that followed was heavy with uncertainty. His son, Rehoboam, traveled to Shechem to claim the crown, but the people were waiting. They did not bow. Instead, they brought a list of grievances, pointing to the crushing weight of the labor and the taxes that had built the temple. Rehoboam dismissed the elders who urged him to listen. He turned to his own peers, his face hardening as he formulated his response. He returned to the assembly, his voice echoing across the courtyard, promising not relief, but a yoke twice as heavy as his father's. The reaction was immediate. A murmur rose from the crowd, then a roar of defiance. The northern tribes turned their backs on the throne. They gathered their belongings, abandoned the city, and marched north, leaving the capital isolated. Borders were drawn in the dust, and watchtowers were manned by brothers who now looked at each other as strangers. The slopes of Mount Carmel were crowded with the silent masses, their eyes fixed on the two altars. The priests of Baal moved in a frantic circle, their voices rising to a rhythmic, desperate scream. They cut their skin with blades, staining the dust, calling for a spark that never came. By midday, their altar remained cold, the meat untouched by anything but flies. Elijah stood apart, his hands steady. He dug a trench around the base, deep and wide. He laid the wood, placed the bull, and then ordered the jars brought forward. Water poured over the sacrifice, soaking the wood, filling the trench until it overflowed. Elijah stepped forward, his posture rigid, his voice low and clear as he spoke to the sky. The air shifted. A pillar of white fire struck the altar with the force of a hammer. It vaporized the water, turned the stones to ash. The streets of Jerusalem were thick with the smell of incense and roasting meat, a city thriving on the surface while rotting within. Isaiah walked the main thoroughfare, his feet marking the stone pavement, his voice cutting through the noise of the merchants. He spoke of crumbling walls and a coming exile, but the traders only laughed, turning back to their scales and coin. They measured grain and silver, eyes locked on profit, ignoring the man who stood in their path. Jeremiah followed, his face etched with the weight of the visions he carried. He stood at the city gate, watching the caravans arrive, his warnings falling like dry leaves into a rushing river. He pointed to the neglected widows and the broken scales of the courts, demanding justice that no one wanted to provide. The people pushed past him, their shoulders brushing his, their faces set in masks of calculated indifference. They were busy with the business of survival, convinced that the stone walls of the temple would shield them from any consequence. The prophets watched the city sleepwalk toward the edge of a cliff, their voices fading into the relentless hum of a populace that had already decided its fate. The warnings ended when the iron arrived. Dust clouds rose on the horizon, not from wind, but from the marching feet of the Assyrian host. The northern gates splintered under the impact of heavy rams, and the city walls collapsed in a roar of stone and mortar. In the south, the Babylonian fires took hold. Tongues of flame licked the cedar beams of the temple, turning the gold to molten rivers that ran down the steps. The air grew thick with the acrid stench of burning scrolls and scorched stone. Soldiers moved through the streets, pulling the inhabitants from their homes, binding their wrists with cold, biting iron. The pride of the kingdom was dismantled in a single season of smoke and steel. Months later, the noise of the siege had faded into a hollow, aching silence. The exiles sat by the sluggish waters of the Euphrates, their feet buried in the silt. They watched the river flow, clutching nothing but the memory of a city that was now only ash. The temple was gone. The throne was empty. They stared into the water, waiting for a sign that the world had not ended entirely. The landscape of their lives had been erased, leaving only the weight of the chains. Years of captivity dragged on, measured by the slow turn of the seasons and the settling of dust on the riverbanks. Then, the decree arrived. The iron gates of their exile swung open, and the long trek back to the ruins began. Ezra and Nehemiah stood amidst the rubble of Jerusalem, their hands calloused from the work of clearing the debris. They hauled limestone blocks from the wreckage, fitting them together with mortar and sweat. Every stone set in place was a defiance of the past, a physical reclamation of the ground beneath their feet. The walls rose slowly, a jagged line against the sky, shielding the city from the wind once more. They worked from dawn until the last light faded, their movements rhythmic and steady. The temple site was cleared, the foundation stones scoured of ash. They waited in the quiet of the evening, their hearts fixed on a distant, unspoken hope. The horizon stretched wide and empty, ready for a redeemer. The sun dipped below the jagged line of the hills, casting long, thin shadows across the newly laid stones. The city was quiet, the air cooling as the stars began to pierce the darkening dome above. Men and women stood on the ramparts, their hands still rough from the mortar, their eyes fixed on the road that stretched into the unknown. They had rebuilt the walls, but the hunger in their chests remained. It was a silence that spoke of centuries of wandering, of blood spilled in fields, and of promises whispered in the desert. They did not speak, but the weight of their collective gaze was heavy. They waited for a shift in the wind, for a sign that the cycle of breaking and mending would finally reach its end. Every rustle of dry grass, every flicker of distant light, drew their attention. They were a people poised on the edge of a threshold, looking toward a future that had not yet taken form. The world felt vast, ancient, and expectant. The night deepened, turning the sky into a velvet expanse of cold, distant light. Below the ramparts, the city slept, but the watchers remained. their silhouettes etched against the pale moonlight. They felt the pulse of the earth beneath their feet, a reminder of the dust from which they were formed and the long, winding path they had traveled. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant rain, stirring the embers of a dying fire in the square. No one moved to leave. The silence was not empty. It was a vessel, filled with the weight of generations who had looked for the same sign. They traced the constellations, searching for a pattern that promised a new beginning. The walls they had raised were strong, yet they knew these stones were not the final destination. Their eyes searched the dark expanse beyond the gates, waiting for a movement, a sound, or a sudden shift in the air that would signal the arrival of the one who would heal the fracture in the world. They stood as sentinels of history, holding their ground in the quiet dark. The horizon remained a thin, dark line, yet their resolve did not falter. A faint, silver line began to bleed into the eastern sky, softening the harsh edges of the horizon. The stars, once sharp and piercing, dimmed one by one, as the deep indigo of the night surrendered to the encroaching gray. The watchers on the wall shifted, their joints stiff from hours of stillness, but their gaze remained locked on the distance. The air grew sharp and thin, vibrating with the quiet intensity of a held breath. Then, the first true ray of gold crested the hills, striking the highest stone of the gatehouse. It was not just light, it was an arrival. The long, winding journey through the dust, the blood, and the fire had led to this singular point in time. They did not cheer. They did not move. They simply stood, their faces illuminated by the rising sun, their hearts finally quieted by the certainty of the promise. The world was no longer a place of wandering, but a place of arrival. The cycle of the ages had reached its turning. They watched the light spread across the valley, washing over the ruins and the new foundations alike, preparing for the one who would mend the broken world. The horizon was no longer empty. The wait had ended, and the future began in the silence of the dawn. The sun climbed higher, casting long, clear shadows across the valley that had seen so much. Every stone, every path, and every field held the memory of the long trek from the garden to this moment of stillness. The dew on the grass shimmered, reflecting the vast, open sky that seemed to hold its own breath. There was no more noise of war, no more clamor of kings, and no more weeping by the rivers. The earth itself seemed to settle into a deep, rhythmic peace, as if it were a stage finally cleared for the main act. The people looked down at their hands, then out at the horizon, recognizing that the long history they carried was not a burden, but a path. The story had not ended. It had simply shed its skin. Everything that had been broken, everything that had been lost, and everything that had been promised now converged. They turned away from the ramparts, walking down into the city, their steps firm and measured. The world was ready. The city gates swung open, the heavy timber groaning against the stone. Yet the sound was not a disturbance. It was an invitation. Those who had watched from the walls now walked into the streets, their movements deliberate and calm. The dust of the long journey had settled, replaced by the crisp, cool air of a morning that felt entirely new. There was no urgency, no frantic search for meaning, for the meaning was now etched into the very soil they walked upon. They moved toward the center of the city, passing the foundations of the old temple and the new walls, each stone a testament to the endurance. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of a promise kept. They reached the square and stopped, looking up. The cycle of the ages had closed, and the door to the future stood wide. Every heartbeat and every step was now part of a story. The horizon held no more shadows, only the infinite, quiet potential of what was to come. The world was finally, and completely, at peace. The light deepened, gold and amber washing over the stone floor of the square. No one spoke. The weight of centuries, of wanderings, of battles, and of prayers seemed to lift from their shoulders. They looked at the horizon, not with the frantic eyes of those seeking shelter, but with the steady gaze of those who know the destination. The promise, once a distant spark in the dark, now burned with the clarity of a steady flame. They understood that the history they held was a bridge, not a wall. Each life, each struggle, and each act of faith had been a thread woven into a larger design. They turned their faces toward the light, sensing the shift in the wind, a a subtle change that signaled the arrival of something long awaited. The world held its breath. The broken pieces of the past were no longer fragments, but the foundation for a new beginning. They stepped forward, together, moving toward the edge of the known, ready to meet the future. The silence was absolute, a perfect, expectant stillness. Everything was ready. The sky began to pale, the deep indigo of the night yielding to a soft, persistent glow. It was not a sudden burst, but a slow, inevitable unveiling. The earth itself seemed to hum with the quiet intensity of a long-held breath finally being released. Every stone, every path, and every memory of the journey now stood bathed in the clarity of this new light. The anticipation that had anchored the hearts of the people for generations was no longer a distant hope, but a tangible reality pressing against the edges of the world. They stood in the silence, their eyes fixed on the point where the earth met the heavens. There was no need for words. The history of the struggle, the weight of the law, and the echoes of the prophets had all converged into this single, suspended moment. The horizon shimmered, a threshold between the world that had been and the world that was about to be made whole. The long wait was over. The promise, once etched in stone and spoken in whispers, now stood ready to walk among them. The world was still, expectant, and finally, completely awake. The light crested the ridge, spilling across the valley in a flood of unyielding brilliance. It touched the dust, the stone, and the faces of those who had watched through the long night. The shadows that had defined their struggle for centuries dissolved, leaving only the clarity of a new day. There was no more waiting. The promise, once a distant echo in the hearts of the faithful, had become the air they breathed. Every step taken in the wilderness, every law written on stone, and every prophecy whispered in the dark had led to this singular point of arrival. The world stood transformed, its ancient cracks filled by the weight of a dawning peace. The cycle of exile and return, of falling and rising, had reached its final cadence. They looked forward, not into the unknown, but into the fulfillment of what had been spoken from the beginning. The horizon was no longer a boundary, but an open gate. The long journey of the ages had found its destination. The silence of the past gave way to the resonance of the present. Everything that was broken began to mend in the warmth of the rising sun. The story was complete, and yet, the true beginning had only just started. The echoes of the past settled into the earth, no longer haunting, but grounding the present. Where once there was only the ache of longing, there was now the steady pulse of a reality made whole. The paths carved by generations of struggle were now illuminated, their purpose revealed in the quietude of the morning. Every stone laid, every word spoken, and every prayer offered had served as a foundation for this moment of absolute stillness. The world breathed in the light, a vast landscape finally at rest. There was no more searching for the horizon, for the horizon had come to meet them. The story did not end with a closing of a book, but with the opening of a door. Life continued, but the rhythm had changed. The weight of the old burdens had lifted, replaced by a clarity that reached into the deepest corners of the earth. They walked forward, not as wanderers, but as witnesses to a promise kept. The journey had reached its true beginning. Time itself seemed to pause, holding the weight of the ages in a single suspended breath. The records of the past were not merely ink on parchment, but the very marrow of the world that remained. Where there had been chaos, there was now order. Where there had been division, there was now a singular, enduring thread. The legacy of those who walked the path before was etched into the soil and the stars alike. They were no longer figures in a distant tale, but the architects of the present. Every struggle, every triumph, and every quiet act of faith had woven itself into a tapestry that spanned the breadth of human experience. The story had found its anchor in the heart of reality, and there it would stay, silent, profound, and complete. The long work was finished, and the light remained. The final page turned, yet the story did not cease. It expanded, spilling over the boundaries of memory, into the vast, unwritten expanse of what was to come. The horizon, once a distant line, now shimmered, with the clarity of a promise fulfilled. Every generation that had passed, every trial endured, and every voice raised in faith had converged into this singular, expansive moment. The world stood poised, no longer looking back at the ruins or the triumphs, but forward into the uncharted territory of grace. The architecture of the past served only as the foundation for a structure that reached toward the infinite. There was no more waiting for the dawn, for the light had already taken root in the soil of the earth. The struggle had refined the spirit of the world, leaving it tempered and ready for the unfolding of a new era. The echoes of the past finally settled into the quiet earth. What was once a scattered collection of voices and events had unified into a single, resonant truth. The long journey, spanning from the first spark of light to the final hope of the Redeemer, had reached its destination. There was no more distance to cover, no more trials to endure. The narrative had ceased its movement, not because it had ended, but because it had become the very air the world breathed. The promise was no longer a distant star, but the ground beneath every footstep. All the broken pieces had been gathered, all the debts paid, and all the questions answered by the simple, enduring presence of the light. The horizon had vanished, replaced by the reality of a world made whole. Time stood still, held in the balance of a perfect, quiet peace. The story was no longer being told, it was being lived. The cycle had come to rest, and in that stillness, the world remained, anchored forever in the promise that had been kept. The light now burned with a steady, unyielding brilliance.